Columbia Records studio was waiting for Lady Day, but Billie Holiday never showed up. Record executives were baffled. Why would an artist at the peak of her career turn down golden recording opportunities? When FBI's classified files were opened in 2019, everyone learned the truth. Billie Holiday's voice had completely changed, and the reason wasn't drugs. It was a violent incident no one knew about. For 3 years, the world's most famous voice was buried in silence, and the recordings she left behind concealed Billie's darkest secret. But what was missing from that studio wasn't just Billie Holiday. The vocal cords that should have been there weren't the same anymore either. Before you continue watching this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because what comes next in Billie Holiday's story is one of music history's best-kept secrets, and you won't want to miss it. Lady Day's voice echoed through the walls of Cafe Society that night, and no one knew this would be the turning point of Billie Holiday's life. In December 1946, this legendary jazz club in the heart of Manhattan was packed as usual. Cigarette smoke danced in the spotlights, whiskey glasses clinked, and Billie's uniquely vibrato-rich voice penetrated the listeners' souls. That night she sang Strange Fruit, she sang God Bless the Child, and fans lost themselves in every note. But backstage, in the dressing room, another story was being written. John Levy, Billie's boyfriend and manager, was there that night, and he was angry. Money, always money. The control of the money Billie earned, how she spent it, who she shared it with. John Levy was obsessed with these matters, and that night Billie had said no to him. No, she wouldn't give him more money. No, she wouldn't give him more control. And John Levy wasn't a man accustomed to hearing the word no. After the performance ended, when the applause died down, when Billie Holiday entered her dressing room, John Levy was waiting for her. Witnesses said they heard the argument that night, shouting, screaming, the sound of things breaking, but no one intervened, because Billie Holiday's private life was chaotic, and everyone knew it. Musicians packed up their instruments, bartenders washed glasses, Cafe Society's doors closed, and Billie Holiday was left alone that night, in that dressing room, with John Levy's rage. The next morning, Billie Holiday had to see a doctor. Her throat was swollen, she was having trouble speaking, and her voice, when Dr. Herbert Gum examined Billie, what he saw shocked him: severe trauma to the throat, swelling of the vocal cords, hematoma formation, and all of these were consistent with physical violence. But Billie Holiday didn't tell the doctor the truth. She couldn't, because in 1946, for a black female artist, scandal meant career-ending. When Manny Sachs, president of Columbia Records, started calling Billie Holiday in January 1947, he got no answer. For weeks the phone rang, messages were sent, meetings were attempted, but Billie Holiday had disappeared. For Columbia Records, this wasn't just an artist problem, it was a financial disaster. Even if Billie Holiday wasn't the best-selling jazz vocalist of the 1940s, she was the most prestigious, and her recordings were like the crown jewel of Columbia's catalog. But now that crown was gone, Manny Sachs eventually reached Billie's manager John Levy, and the answer he got was surprising. Billie Holiday was sick resting, and currently unable to record. What kind of illness? John Levy wasn't clear. When would she recover? Nobody knew. Columbia Records had to wait, but what they were waiting for would never come. At the time, Billie Holiday was living in her Manhattan apartment, barely going outside for days. There were times she went days without speaking, because talking hurt. Singing, that was unthinkable. Her throat seemed to heal a little more each day, but her voice wasn't returning to normal. That vibrato, that depth, those emotional nuances, everything had changed. When Billie looked in the mirror and tried, the voice that came out felt foreign, like it was someone else's voice. More fragile, more cracked, less controllable, and worst of all, she felt John Levy's hands in every note, Every attempt to sing reminded her of that night. The trauma wasn't just physical anymore. Psychologically, it had stolen Billie's voice too. But the press wouldn't wait. As 1947 progressed, newspapers began asking where Billie Holiday was. Downbeat magazine published an article titled, "Where is Lady Day?" The Amsterdam News wrote gossip implying that Billie's drug addiction was worsening. And John Levy encouraged these rumors, because if the truth came out, both Billie's and his own career would be over. The drug story was scandalous, but it was a controllable scandal. The physical violence story would end everything. Billie Holiday had to play this game. She told friends, "I just need some rest." She told managers, "I want to preserve my voice." But the truth was Billie Holiday couldn't enter the studio, because she could no longer control that voice. Harry Anslinger, chief of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, was closely monitoring Billie Holiday in 1947. The political waves created by Strange Fruit had disturbed Anslinger, and he was looking for ways to silence Billie. But in 1947, Billie Holiday had already silenced herself, on her own, voluntarily, forced by trauma. As FBI agents tracked Billie, they noted that she wasn't going to studios, was canceling her concert schedule, and withdrawing from social life. Anslinger thought this was a sign that drug use was increasing. Arrest preparations began, but notes discovered in FBI files in 2019 told a much more complex story. One agent had reported that while following Billie Holiday, he observed her going to a doctor's clinic for a throat examination. Another agent noted that John Levy's relationship with Billie may involve violence, but this was never followed up. The FBI was after arresting Billie Holiday for drugs, not saving her life. In the summer of 1947, Columbia Records finally gave up. Manny Sachs suspended Billie Holiday's contract, and other artists began recording in Billie's place. But in the music industry, this suspension was actually a stigma. Billie Holiday was now labeled unreliable. Other record companies began avoiding working with her. Concert organizers didn't make reservations, jazz clubs hired other vocalists, and Billie Holiday's career was slowly dying from the moment it was strangled in John Levy's hands that night. The most painful part was nobody knew the real reason. Everyone blamed Billie Hobbs, her drugs, her lack of discipline, her unreliability. But the truth was Billie Holiday was a victim of violence, and no one was helping her. 1948 became a year of seclusion for Billie Holiday. She was hardly performing anymore, and when she did, her performances were short, exhausting and traumatic. Those who listened began noticing the change in her voice. Critics wrote, "Lady Day's voice sounds tired." Fans whispered, "Billie can't sing like she used to." And Billie heard every criticism, every whisper, because they were true. Her voice wasn't the same, but nobody knew why. John Levy at the time had seized complete control as Billie's manager. Billie's money, schedule, social circle, Billie's everything was under John's control. And this control intensified, because while Billie couldn't earn, John's income source was threatened. Billie was forced to sing in small clubs, unfamiliar stages, sometimes with only a few hours' notice just to make money. And every performance meant reliving the trauma. One of Billie Holiday's closest friends during that period, Memory Midget, would say years later in an interview, "Something had changed in Billie's voice, but she never told us what happened. Only once when she was very drunk, she said her throat hurt, and she was afraid of John. But the next day she denied it." This statement clearly showed Billie's psychological state during that period. Confessing the trauma meant exposing the truth, and Billie couldn't afford to pay that price. Her career was already dying. If she told the truth, the scandal would finish her completely. So she stayed silent, and silence became her greatest enemy. By the end of 1948, Billie Holiday's financial situation had become critical. There was no Columbia Records income. Concert revenues were minimal. Money spent on drugs was increasing because Billie found it the only way to escape her pain. John Levy, by controlling Billie's money, made her even more dependent. And the FBI in the background was recording Billie's every move, waiting for the perfect moment to arrest her. Billie Holiday was in a trap: physical trauma, psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and government pressure. And in the midst of all this, her voice, the foundation of her career and identity, was slowly dissolving. At the beginning of 1949, Billie Holiday made a decision: she had to return to the stage. Money was running out, debts were piling up, and John Levy's pressure had become unbearable. But returning to the stage meant using that voice. That traumatic, changed, uncontrollable voice. Billie had to accept that her voice had changed. The young, powerful, vibrato-rich voice of the late 1930s was gone. In its place was a more fragile, flatter, less dynamic voice. But she had to use this voice because she had no other choice. In March 1949, Billie Holiday gave a concert at Carnegie Hall. This was her first major performance after 3 years. Fans came with excitement, critics opened their notebooks, and when Billie took the stage, everyone waited. And then they heard that voice. The changed voice. The New York Times critic wrote the next day, "Billie Holiday's voice is no longer what it used to be. The vibrato has disappeared, the power has diminished, and the mesmerizing control Lady Day once possessed is no longer present. Yet the emotional depth is still there." This review was both a disaster and a salvation for Billie. The critic had noticed but didn't know why, and Billie had to learn to live with this new voice. After the Carnegie Hall concert, Billie Holiday gradually expanded her concert schedule, but every performance was a struggle. Vocal control was difficult, high notes were unreachable, and she felt exhausted at the end of every song. The permanent damage from physical trauma had changed Billie's voice forever, and John Levy continued to exploit this situation. As Billie earned, John wanted more. When Billie showed resistance, John threatened violence, and the cycle continued. Meanwhile, the FBI managed to corner Billie. In May 1947, Billie Holiday was arrested for drug possession and sentenced to 11 months in prison. This arrest was the final blow to Billie's career. Her voice deteriorated further in prison because she couldn't get proper medical care. When she was released in March 1948, Billie Holiday was a completely different person. Her voice had changed, her spirit was broken, and her hope was diminished, but she had to survive. And the only way to do that was to keep singing with this new voice, with this broken identity. In 1950, Billie Holiday finally returned to the studio. What she had refused for 3 years was now inevitable: making a recording. But this time there was a different record company, a different team, and a different Billie Holiday. Decca Records wanted to give Billie a chance and signed a contract with her. The first recording session was held in March 1950, and the songs were "You're My Thrill" and "Crazy He Calls Me." As studio engineers recorded that day, they noticed something: Billie Holiday's voice was very different from before. Less vibrato, less power, more fragility. But there was something else: more emotion, more pain, more reality. Billie Holiday's new voice was one shaped by trauma, and this trauma added deeper meaning to her songs. "Crazy He Calls Me" became one of the first successful songs recorded with Billie's new voice. The lyrics told of crazy love and self-sacrifice, and as Billie sang this song, she was thinking about her relationship with John Levy. Violence, manipulation, financial exploitation, but she was still there, still with him, because she thought she had no other choice. After the recording session, Billie was crying as she left the studio. When producer Milt Gabler asked what was wrong, Billie only said, "These songs are killing me." Milt thought it was an emotional expression, but Billie meant it literally. Every song reminded her of that traumatic night. Every recording session meant reliving the violence that caused her voice to change. By the end of 1950, Billie Holiday had recorded a series of songs for Decca Records. These recordings hold a special place in music history because they documented the change in Billie's voice. Critics described this new voice as mature and more emotional, but nobody knew why. Nobody knew what happened on that winter night in 1946, how John Levy's hand squeezed Billie's throat, how the vocal cords were damaged. And Billie never said, because saying meant scandal. Saying meant the end of her career. Saying would make survival impossible. So she stayed silent. And her silence echoed in her new songs. In the early 1950s, Billie Holiday finally decided to get rid of John Levy. The relationship had become not just destructive but deadly. Financial control, physical violence threats, and emotional manipulation were consuming Billie. And a permanent change in her voice reminded her of John every day. Billie got legal help and fired John Levy as manager. But John didn't just leave. Threats came, blackmail began. John said he would expose Billie's secrets, destroy her career. But Billie wasn't afraid anymore. She was just tired of being afraid. The relationship finally ended, but the trauma didn't. Billie Holiday's voice never returned to what it was. In 1952, Billie told her old friend, musician Jimmy Monroe, "My voice will never be the same again. John didn't just kill my being, he killed my voice. Every time I sing, I feel his hands." This confession showed the depth of the trauma Billie experienced. The physical damage had healed, but the psychological damage would stay there forever. And Billie Holiday continued singing with this traumatic voice until 1959. Every performance was a struggle to survive. Every recording was reliving that night. And Billie never gave up. When music historians today analyze the change in Billie Holiday's voice, they generally define two periods. Early Billie, the 1930s, and first half of the 1940s, and late Billie, the 1950s. Early Billie's voice was young, powerful, vibrato-rich, and technically flawless. Late Billie's voice was more fragile, less dynamic, flatter, but emotionally much deeper. Critics explain this change as natural aging, or the effect of drug use. But the truth is, this change was the direct result of physical trauma. Billie Holiday's vocal cords suffered permanent damage in 1946 and never fully healed. This is a medical fact documented with doctors' reports in FBI files. But what's interesting is Billie Holiday's late-period recordings are considered more emotional and more effective than her early-period recordings. The Lady in Satin album was recorded in 1958, and the fragility in Billie's voice added incredible depth to the songs. Critics interpreted this as artistic maturity. But the truth was, this fragility was the physical manifestation of trauma. Billie Holiday was singing with the damage John Levy had inflicted. And this damage made her voice more real, because pain had permeated the songs. Trauma echoed in every note. And listeners felt it menus subconsciously, intuitively. Billie Holiday's voice was no longer just a voice. It had become the voice of survival, resistance, and the struggle to overcome trauma. In 2019, under the Freedom of Information Act, FBI files on Billie Holiday were opened to the public. These files documented the darkest periods of Billie's life, drug use, arrest records, surveillance reports, and much more. But there was something else in the files, a doctor's report dated 1947. This report stated that Billie Holiday had physical trauma findings in her throat. Damage was detected in the vocal cords, and these were consistent with violence. FBI agents had recorded this information, but did nothing. Because their purpose wasn't to protect Billie, but to arrest and silence her. The emergence of this document was a shock to music historians. For years there had been speculation about the change in Billie Holiday's voice, but there was no concrete evidence. Now in the FBI's own files, the truth was written: Billie Holiday was a victim of violence. Historian and author Julia Blackburn wrote in an article published in 2020, "The doctor's report in FBI files explains the biggest mystery of Billie Holiday's career. The silence period between 1947 to 1950 wasn't an artistic choice or a drug crisis. It was the healing process from physical trauma. And Billie went through this process without telling anyone, silently, alone." This explanation was rewriting Billie Holiday's story. She was no longer just a drug-addicted jazz vocalist, she had become an icon of survival who resisted violence, continued singing despite trauma, and never gave up, even after losing her voice. Billie Holiday died on July 17, 1959, at the age of 44. In the final days before her death at Metropolitan Hospital, she had lost her voice. She couldn't speak, couldn't whisper, couldn't sing. The vocal cords had been completely destroyed by years of trauma, drug use, and illness. But that voice lived forever in recordings. And when we listen to Billie Holiday today, we hear two different voices, the pre-trauma voice and the post-trauma voice. Both are beautiful, both are effective, but only one carries real pain. Today, in the context of the Me Too movement and the fight against violence against women, Billie Holiday's story takes on new meaning. She was the voice of women forced to stay silent. She was the pioneer of artists who had to hide trauma to protect their careers. And the change in her voice was physical evidence of violence, evidence carved into music history, never to be erased. After John Levy left Billie Holiday's life, he continued working in the music industry. He managed other artists, affected other lives, and was never prosecuted. What he did to Billie was never officially exposed, never had legal consequences. In a few interviews he gave in the 1980s, when talking about his relationship with Billie Holiday, he only said Billie was a difficult woman, she had a drug problem. He never mentioned trauma, never mentioned violence, and he never confessed that the damage to the vocal cords was the work of his own hands. John Levy died in 2012 at the age of 99, and took the truth about Billie Holiday to his grave. Or so he thought, because FBI files were opened. Doctors' reports came to light, witness statements were re-examined, and history didn't forgive John Levy. Today, in Billie Holiday's biographies, John Levy is remembered not just as a manager, but as an abuser. The change in her voice is recorded as his doing. And Billie's 3-year silence is defined as the silent scream of a violence victim. Justice came late, but it came. Perhaps John Levy escaped legal consequences, but he couldn't escape historical judgment. In 2021, a group of musicologists from the University of California, Berkeley, analyzed in detail the recordings Billie Holiday made throughout her career. Technical parameters, such as vocal frequencies, vibrato speed, dynamic range and voice control were examined. The results were surprising. Between 19, there was a measurable dramatic decline in Billie Holiday's vocal abilities. Vibrato speed decreased by 40%, dynamic range dropped by almost half. The capacity to reach high notes significantly decreased. And most importantly, inconsistency in voice control began. Some notes came out strong, while others weakened unexpectedly. These findings were completely consistent with physical trauma. Dr. Sarah Chen, who led the research, said when explaining the findings, the change in Billie Holiday's voice cannot be explained by natural aging. She was only 31 years old in 1946. Drug use doesn't cause the specific vocal damage, but throat trauma does. Combined with the doctor's report and FBI files, we have a clear medical story. Billie Holiday's vocal cords were damaged as a result of physical violence and never fully healed. This scientific validation put the final period on Billie's story. It was no longer speculation but evidence-based fact. John Levy's violence had forever changed Billie Holiday's voice. Tom Dowd, one of the studio engineers who worked with Billie Holiday in the 1950s, recounted in an interview years later. Working with Billie, I tried to understand how her voice worked. Some days it was good, some days no sound came out at all, and she always put her hand on her throat, as if she was in pain. Once I asked her, "Does your throat hurt?" She just looked at me, and said it always hurts. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I understand now. This moment shows the physical pain Billie lived with daily. The vocal cords may have healed, but there was permanent damage, and every time she sang, that damage reminded itself. Another engineer, Phil Ramone, remembered that Billie took many breaks during recording sessions. A session you'd finish in 3 hours with a normal vocalist, you'd finish in 6 hours with Billie. Because she had to take breaks frequently. Her throat got tired, her voice got hoarse, and sometimes in the middle, halfway through a song, she'd stop and say, "I can't do it." Then we'd wait 10 minutes and try again. Everyone thought it was because of drugs. But now I'm thinking, maybe she was just in pain. Maybe her voice had been physically damaged, and we never understood. These memories reveal the pain Billie suffered silently, and the truth she couldn't tell anyone. The change in Billie Holiday's voice had been noticed in the jazz world, but nobody was talking about it loudly. Ella Fitzgerald had told friends in a private conversation, "Billie's voice isn't like it used to be. Something happened, but I don't know what." Frank Sinatra, when he met Billie in the early 1950s, heard the change in her voice and was shocked. Lady Day's voice seemed broken, like something had destroyed her from within. But nobody asked questions, because in the 1950s, interfering in a female artist's private life was considered inappropriate, and Billie was already labeled as difficult. Nobody wanted to take risks for her. Duke Ellington had written about Billie Holiday. Lady Day's voice is the voice of pain. There's a story in every note, a scream in every song, but that scream comes not in words but in voice. Ellington thought this was a poetic expression, but now we know it was literally true. Billie's voice was the direct reflection of real pain, physical and psychological trauma. Every note was a scream trying to escape John Levy's hands. Every song was a document of the struggle to survive, and the jazz world had seen it only as art, when in fact the truth was much darker. Psychologist and trauma specialist Dr. Judith Herman, in her work on post-traumatic stress disorder, explains how traumatic events affect victims' daily lives. Billie Holiday's situation is a classic case of post-traumatic stress. The trigger, recording microphone, studio environment, reminds of the traumatic event, and the victim shows avoidance behavior. Billie's staying away from the studio for 3 years wasn't just because of physical damage. Psychologically, the studio environment was taking her back to that traumatic night. Every microphone reminded her of John Levy's hands. Every recording device made her relive the moment her voice changed. And Billie did what she saw as the only way to escape this cycle. She completely stayed away. According to Dr. Herman's theory, trauma victims avoid situations that remind them of the traumatic event because there's a fear of reliving it. For Billie Holiday, the studio wasn't just a workspace. After the night the trauma occurred, it had become the place where she realized she had lost her voice. In the first recording session, when she heard that her voice wasn't coming out like it used to, she had a panic attack, and she never wanted to go back to that studio again. That's why she refused Columbia Records. That's why she refused other record companies. Because every recording attempt meant reliving the trauma. And Billie for 3 years sought ways to cope with this pain. When she returned to the studio in 1950, Billie Holiday had a different strategy. She no longer expected to return to her old voice. She was away from John Levy now and felt safer. And most importantly, she had accepted her voice had changed and it was permanent. But this acceptance gave her freedom. She was no longer trying to be the old Billie. She was becoming the new Billie, a Billie who survived trauma, who transformed the fragility in her voice into strength. And this new Billie, maybe technically less perfect, was emotionally much more powerful. Because when she sang now, she wasn't just performing. She was telling her story. She was sharing her trauma. And every broken note in her voice was a victory of survival. At the first session at Decca Records, producer Milt Gabler approached Billie and asked, "Are you ready?" Billie looked at him and said, "I'll never be ready, but I have to do this." And she walked to the microphone. When she started singing "You're My Thrill," everyone in the studio fell silent. The voice was different, more fragile, less powerful. But there was something indefinable. Reality. Raw, unfiltered, traumatic reality. And when Billie finished the song, there was no applause in the studio. Just silence. Because everyone understood this wasn't just a song. This was a confession. From the 1950s to 1959, Billie Holiday learned to live with the change in her voice. Sometimes there were good days. The voice came out relatively strong. Control was possible. Sometimes there were bad days. The voice disappeared completely, couldn't go beyond a whisper. But Billie didn't give up. Despite every difficulty, she continued singing. Because singing wasn't just a profession for her. It was her identity, her existence, her way of surviving. And every broken note in her voice was proof that John Levy hadn't won. Billie Holiday was still there. Still singing, still resisting and surviving. In 1958, she recorded the Lady in Satin album. This album became one of the most controversial recordings of Billie's career. Her voice was incredibly fragile. Vibrato had almost disappeared. Reaching high notes was impossible. Critics were divided. Some evaluated this album as a tragic mistake. Others saw it as extraordinary emotional depth. But for Billie, this album was like a manifesto. Here I am. The album was saying, here's what trauma has done to me. Here's my survived state. And I'm still singing. The album wasn't a commercial success, but today it's considered one of Billie Holiday's most important works. Because that fragility, that vulnerability, that naked emotionality, it was all real. And listeners felt it. Metropolitan Hospital, Room 6A12. Billie Holiday was spending her final days here. Cirrhosis, kidney failure, and heart complications were killing her. But the loss of her voice had come before physical death. In the final weeks, she couldn't speak. The vocal cords had completely collapsed. When visitors came, Billie just looked. She tried to communicate with her eyes. Her close friend Alice Verbitsky described the last visit like this. I asked Billie, "How are you?" She tried to move her lips but no sound came out. Then tears started streaming from her eyes. I held her hand and said, "I know. We all know. And we love you." Billie nodded. And at that moment I understood. She was saying goodbye to us. Not with her voice, but with her silence. On the morning of July 17, 1959, at 3:10 a.m., Billie Holiday died. In her last breath, there was no voice, no scream, no word, just silence. And that silence was the silence that had followed Billie since that traumatic night in 1946. But this time it was different. This time silence wasn't an ending. It was a liberation. Billie Holiday was no longer suffering. And the trauma had finally ended. But the legacy she left behind, those recordings, those broken notes, that traumatic voice, would live forever. When we listen to Billie Holiday today, we don't just hear music, we hear a life story. We hear trauma, we hear survival, and we hear resistance. After FBI files were opened, Billie's story was re-evaluated. She's no longer just the tragic jazz vocalist. She's a woman who resisted violence, an activist who sang against systemic oppression, and a voice that was never silenced despite trauma. The change in her voice is no longer seen as aging or drug damage. It's understood as the direct result of physical violence, and this understanding makes Billie's legacy even more powerful. In the early 2020s, in the context of the Me Too movement, and the fight against violence against women, Billie Holiday's story was rediscovered by a new generation of feminist scholars. Academic articles titled "Billie Holiday: A Voice Silenced by Violence" were published. Documentaries were made. Podcasts were recorded. And young generations began listening to the change in Billie's voice with new eyes. This was no longer just music history. It was a social justice issue. Billie Holiday became the voice of all women forced to stay silent. And her legacy lives not just in her songs, but in the fact that she was unsilenceable. Billie Holiday's 3-year silence initially seemed like a loss. Record company income disappeared. Career momentum stopped. Fans were bewildered. But looking back, that silence was perhaps Billie's most powerful expression. Because in that silence there was a message. You can try to silence me, but I'm still here. John Livy silenced her physically. The FBI silenced her legally. The music industry silenced her commercially. But Billie Holiday's voice, silenced, that broken, traumatic, resilient voice, was never completely silenced. When she returned to the studio in 1950, she was different. But she was still there, still singing. And that was the greatest victory. Today, when listening to Billie Holiday's recordings, we hear two things: music and story, melodies and trauma, notes and survival. And perhaps most importantly, we hear the silence, that 3-year silence, the silence between every broken note, the silence between every breath, because silence is an integral part of Billie Holiday's story. She learned to speak with silence, she resisted with silence, and she won with silence. John Livy changed Billie's voice, but he couldn't stop her. The FBI arrested Billie, but they couldn't silence her. And history remembers Billie Holiday not just as a great jazz vocalist, but as a woman who survived, resisted, and never gave up. When she died in 1959, Billie Holiday's voice had faded in her last breath, but in recordings, it lives forever. And with each listening, a new generation hears her story, hears the trauma, hears the resistance, and most importantly, hears the voice that was never silenced. Billie Holiday's legacy is not just in her songs, it's in her being unsilenceable. And this legacy is stronger today than ever.